Hello, and welcome to another In Conversation with Steve Quartermain. And today I'm delighted to have as my guest Gail Mayhew. Now, good. Hello, Gail.
Delighted to be here, Steve. Nice to see you.
Now we worked together on the when you were commissioner of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and one of the things I want to talk to you about today is stewardship. Now, one of the things that came out of the report was a call for there to be more attention paid to how stewardship might change the way development is delivered. And I suppose I want to ask you at the beginning to sort of explain a bit more about what's meant by stewardship.
Well, Steve, standing back from the question, doing the Building Beautiful Commission work, one of the things that we were at pains to try to get to the bottom of was not just how to define what better quality development would look like, but how we could actually genuinely deliver a step change in quality. So starting from that perspective, what we did, we sort of looked around at some of the best quality contemporary schemes that had been built. And in almost every situation where there was better quality, we saw that the land interest and the project actually had a much longer time perspective than your standard build out. So the reason that we kind of got to that proposition was through analysing what was going out there in the development world. And so what we really meant by stewardship was really the length of time. It's about a patient approach to land and the finance that comes into development.
Okay, so it's a different model from the developer buying a piece of land, developing it, selling it off as quickly as possible, and then moving on. It's something different.
That's exactly right, Steve. So what we were identifying was that there were really sort of two issues conflating on house building. One is the activity of making a great place and putting the infrastructure in to do that placemaking exercise, and then the building of houses and other property that might make up that community. And effectively what we were identifying in stewardship was that first activity, the placemaking and the infrastructuring of land, potentially needs to be done under a much longer time horizon than the much more short-term activity of building property. And by separating out those two activities, it's our view that we could potentially fund the first exercise, the stewardship exercise, potentially over a much longer time frame, which we think is the essential component to making better quality places begin to start emerging.
Okay. Well, let me unpack that a bit then. If I may, let me refer to it as sort of the standard approach to development. If I'm building a site now and I buy a piece of land or I take an option on a piece of land, and I get planning permission for it, then there's good examples about how people have developed and delivered good quality places. And one of the things that was in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission's report was this idea of a kite mark. Now, I could see a situation where if I could demonstrate that I was the sort of developer that produced great places, and the infrastructure was there and it was open and green and healthy, and people like living there and it was well designed, you might say I'm the sort of developer that gets a kite mark, that you can trust me to deliver a good place. Now, it strikes me that that's one way of just looking at kite marking good planning, but I think you're probably looking at something deeper than that.
We are, Steve. I think where I mean, there is no doubt that there are people in the market who are building really outstanding quality projects. Not as many as we'd want, but there are people there doing it. Generally speaking, those are schemes, as you say, that are already benefiting from infrastructure potentially, and maybe not on the scale that some of the development programme that we're talking about needs to take place. So, I mean, what we would probably say is that a kite marking exercise to distinguish a developer who is, there to do a quality project and actually to build out what they've negotiated at planning. Absolutely, I think that would help enormously. And amongst those smaller scale schemes, I think that's where there could be a huge impact. But the stewardship proposition really is trying to approach the difficulty of larger schemes where there's more infrastructure required and more placemaking required. And I think that's one of the areas of the market that's really not delivering very well at the moment.
Okay, so the white paper, which is well, the consultation ends this month, but it's sort of still out there, talks about big schemes, perhaps new settlements being something that would come through a development consent order regime and a different sort of approach. I suppose the thinking behind that is about trying to capture some of the broader stuff that you need to deal with infrastructure, like to deliver big places. Now, would your stewardship proposal be incompatible with that sort of approach?
No, it absolutely would not, Steve. But I think what we've looked at development consent order regimes quite closely, and our view is that they're quite heavy duty for the purpose of building communities, as opposed to a single piece of infrastructure. So while I think it provides a mechanism, one of the possibilities we've been looking at, in fact, are local development orders, which sit within the existing planning system. They haven't been exercised extensively within a residential context to date. But our view is that they're probably more flexible and more compatible with the existing planning system. And the problem with the DCO is that you have to have everything tied down on day one. And our experience and knowledge of some of these larger scale schemes, while you do want to tie down a lot, you do also need to allow for flexibility because they're so lengthy. You're running through a number of development cycles.
Yeah. Well, let me come back to that and this idea of a longer timeline. So I'm a landowner then that's interested in getting involved in a longer investment of my time and my asset in delivering a great place. I suppose the question is, famously we've seen people like Prince Charles from Panbury embark on this approach, but for other landowners, why would they do this? Well, what's their incentive?
I think it's interesting. The incentive, I think, is a creative one, partly. I think obviously there's an opportunity to make money for the estate over a period, but I think there's another side to that where you've got a land interest that is there for the long term, which many of them are for multi-generational periods, is that they have to live and work in those communities. They feel a responsibility to the communities, and they need to go. And down the pub is the sort of the standard form of words, but that there are people who they have long-term relationships with, who they feel a responsibility towards. Now, this initiative that we've put together has been careful not just to focus on those very large-scale landowners who have already dipped their toe into this market. I mean, what we're looking at is how you can bring agricultural land into land pools in order to satisfy where planning identifies that development ought to go. So that could be multiple farmers or small scale landowners. It could equally be a local authority. So that stewardship interest is absolutely for the long term, but it doesn't need to be a large scale single interest landowner that needs, that's needed to participate in it.
Okay, so again, let me dig a little bit deeper there. You get a landowner or a group of landowners who buy into the idea that they want a longer term interest in the land. They have got the right, let's say, the right credentials in terms of creating a great place, and they know how to do it. They embark upon this. The site's allocated in a local plan, perhaps, and they then come forward and say, "Well, we'll bring this forward." Just if you can, just explain to me that sort of life cycle of the development. Then, I mean, how do they take it forward, and what the various steps along the line, and how do they make their money?
Yeah, well, the initial step, Steve, under standard planning is that they have to get together and promote that land together under the current planning system. That may change with the white paper, of course. We may see more public involvement in identifying the most appropriate land for development. And that actually may be welcome, because actually there's an awful lot of money possibly spent a bit unnecessarily running competitive promotions, which end up, sometimes going nowhere. And, a lot of money gets kind of spent in that. Main thing is the land interests come together in the knowledge that a local authority is looking positively at a given piece of land. They find a way to associate themselves together. That at the moment is a bit complicated because of the way tax treats them, and we're trying to put a case to Treasury to make that an easier process. If it's a single interest, that makes it easier. They take that land through the planning process. That is expensive, and that's exactly the point that drives a lot of landed interest into the arms of a third-party promoter. We're looking at ways that phase of development can be funded differently. Once you get to planning permission, the rather than sell, the land is vested in an equity position against much longer term patient capital that pays for the infrastructure, and it pays for the placemaking. At that point, the land could potentially be chopped up in a series of different ways. And one of the advantages of the process would be that alongside the volume house builders, who will undoubtedly be major players in the build out, because you've got a long-term stewardship entity sitting there controlling that land, we could just as easily sell to smaller scale regional builders. They could sell to plots to individuals wanting to self-commission, self-build. It changes the geography of how land on the edge of settlements is chopped up. And we think that could be enormously to the benefit of creating a more competitive market and build out.
So as a landowner, do I retain my ownership of the land? So am I selling long-term leasehold to people, or is it not a freehold sale?
You've got a number of options there, Steve, and I think that is very much down to the deal and the financial circumstances of the parties. But either they can sell outright to one of their builders, put it under a set of conditions. A critical point is that through contract, the land interest is able to exercise property controls over the land as in parallel with planning, so that some of the criteria that we would want to see built into design codes can be operated through contract as well as through planning. So you're getting two sets of controls over the land. This is one of the essential points in looking at the exemplary schemes that we looked at, was identifying this dual controls over land. So to your question, either the landowner sells outright, or our modelling has shown that if they've got the ability to sit in a patient position and not take the land value until right at the end once the property is built, everybody benefits from that situation. We think that financially the landowner will get a better return, and it eases the costs on development, especially in the case of the smaller scale builder who's not having to pay for the land up front.
Yeah. You mentioned tax in the answer there, and I'm not going to ask for an explanation as to how the tax system would work. But clearly, there is an issue about not having disincentives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about? I know there's been some research done on some of this theory. I mean, is there any evidence if you go down this sort of approach to development that the outcomes are in any way enhanced over the existing approach?
Well, Steve, what we actually started with was the outcomes. Our research methodology started off looking at where, both in contemporary practice and historically, the best quality urbanism in the UK has emerged. And so actually, by starting from that perspective and then looking at what the development process was that delivered that better quality outcome, in a large swathe of cases, we were identifying this longer term stewardship position as being the essential characteristic of how high quality urbanism through a lot of the 19th century suburbs that are some of the most popular bits of residential real estate now, up and down the UK, but that inner ring of Victorian suburbs tended to be produced on this model. And then through the 20th century, obviously you've got the example of the garden towns, and to a certain extent, that's the sort of logic that was sitting behind them. And then more recently, the work the Duchy of Cornwall and other land interests, Ernest Cook Trust has done some very interesting work in this area. A number of estates and public sector partners. One of our exemplary schemes that we've been looking at was the Crown Street regeneration of the Gorbals in Glasgow, which was a public-public partnership. So, I mean, there is certainly track record and there's certainly robustness to the method.
Do you think thinking about that sort of historic perspective to some of this to this approach, the public engagement in this, are we relying on benevolent philanthropic thinking that's going to say, well, I believe that I can produce a great place, or is there going to be a sort of an opportunity for people either adjacent to or who might indeed then live in the place to have a say on what places might look like?
Well, that's the absolutely essential starting point, Steve. I mean, all of this has to move forward with consent, in our opinion. I mean, I think that actually underscores one of the issues that I personally have around design coding. Design coding is the end point of a revised process towards a good quality master plan, and the starting point for that has to be talking to people about what their aspiration for their place is. And I mean, from our perspective, we think that land interest has a key role to play in asking that question, asking people how they think their place should grow, not limiting it just to, what housing do you need, but actually a much broader question around what's the economic future of this place? What are your needs as a community? How can we help you to live better? And that's, I mean, not only does that potentially get to a different proposition around development, which potentially overcomes some of the hurdles of resistance, but we think it also possibly makes for a better development process commercially, because actually by engaging in that interrogation of what ought to happen given place, you actually uncover a whole set of things that as a professional coming in from outside you might not otherwise know. So yes, absolutely. And it's not just a benevolent, it's actually a proper thing to do from a commercial point of view, we think.
So where's the if you like the tipping point from you've got developers who are busy on the current development model, if I can call it that, and if we're going to say that there's a different model to produce better outcomes with greater public engagement, and the sort of stewardship will produce better returns both commercially but also as in terms of outcomes. Is there a tipping point at which point we're going to suddenly find that everybody realizes this and goes to this new model, or is it still going to be more bespoke? There'll be a site here, a site there.
It's a very interesting question, Steve. I think if we could move forward with the tax equalisation proposal, that, I mean, it's a boring and technical area, but I mean, effectively what we're trying to make sure is that a land interest and an investor coming into this doesn't experience any more risk than under the normal situation. So if we can get that situation sorted on the tax front, and if we can identify the long-term sources of finance that are required to take this forward, I think there will be a tipping point. We saw that actually. I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, I've been observing the rise of the socially responsible investment market, now sort of termed the SG investment market, that attaches very much to the equities world rather than the property world. Property is a bit of a slow coach coming on board with that kind of thinking, but there was certainly a moment when it went from being a small amount of funding under management, which was demonstrating theory around the fact that you could make at least as much money, if not more, by going down that route. And it suddenly mushroomed and became a very mainstream area of property of investment activity. It's our firm belief that stewardship will probably experience a similar trajectory. We need to have a number of exemplar schemes testing this out across different property markets, across different geographies and situations. We've actually tried to assemble a group of land interests that would be prepared to take their land forward under that model. Our ambition was to find one in every county in England so that we'd be able to influence markets locally. From years of observing the way the property market moves, I'm convinced that a few Pathfinder schemes that are successful, that begin to tell that story, and where people can observe how the different business relationships work, will be incredibly influential on behaviour. And yes, absolutely, I think there will be a moment where that would tip. But I think we do need to get that wider range of Pathfinder projects out there. I mean, the interesting thing is kind of what's the moment for change. I think COVID has brought a massive sort of rethink of actually how we live, and there has to be property consequences in that. So without saying, I mean, there's been so many bad things about COVID, but maybe one of the good things is making us all realise that we can live more locally, but then actually that raises a whole question about, well, what do we need to live locally? And I think the kind of model that we're proposing could answer some of that.
Well, I think that's true. The pandemic will make us reset some of our thinking going forward for sure. I suppose to perhaps conclude, Gail, I mean, it's been fascinating to hear your thoughts on this sort of different approach. But I suppose I'm going to, and this may be a difficult question to answer, but if you're going to try and sell this, if your strapline was going to say, now, why should people do this? I mean, is it a question of you can get great outcomes and you can make more money doing this? Is that the line, or is it more a question of you can make as much money as you've ever made before and create much better outcomes? I mean, I'm sort of, it's the same thing, but the other way around. But I mean, what's your sales pitch?
What's my sales pitch? Build back. You know, it's probably build back better. Do it now. The world needs it. We all need it. I think there's some big agendas that it answers, Steve. And I think, it's the right thing to do. But we also think it will make people more money, albeit maybe on a more patient time frame. It's the marshmallow test. If you can hold on, you'll get more down the line. I don't know if you remember that the Americans did an experiment with children, presented them with one marshmallow and told them they could have two if they could wait 20 minutes. So that's really, we're asking the industry to do that.
Hang on for your second marshmallow.
Absolutely.
Gail, thank you very much for that discussion. That's been fascinating, and thank you very much for spending time with me today.
It's been great speaking, Steve. Thanks so much.